you've written?
Well, I've either written or edited somewhere around 50.
My,
so far. I've killed a lot of trees over the years. First one was actually, it was published 50 years ago. It's a biography of John C. Breckinridge, who was our youngest vice president, youngest we will ever have, and ran against Lincoln for the presidency in 1860. And most of what's followed after that has either been in the realm of antebellum Southern history, some of it Civil War studies, not necessarily military, but biography and politics, that sort of thing. And every now and then something I like to step out of the Civil War molds. I did a book called The Pirates Lafitte about Jean and Pierre Lafitte and the smugglers of the Gulf of Mexico. I'm very interested in mythology and finding the root base of fact that often underlays the mythology we have. So folk heroes like the Lafitte's or like David Crockett and others are very interesting to me, both for the myth that we choose to believe and the actuality of their lives that we often tend to overlook.
Sure. Well, I think you've just told us what we're going to be talking to you about, perhaps in some months down the road. That sounds like a great topic to explore. So thanks for joining us. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of the Pursuit of History, and we are excited to have with us tonight William C. Davis. William is a retired professor of history and the former executive director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. He was the on-camera senior consultant and commentator for 52 episodes of the Arts and Entertainment Network History Channel series Civil War Journal, as well as a number of other productions on commercial and public television and for the BBC. He is the award-winning author or editor of more than 50 books in the fields of Civil War and Southern history, as well as many documentary screenplays. His most recent book, The Greatest Fury, The Battle of New Orleans and the Rebirth of America, is the focus of our discussion tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, William.
Thanks, Carrie. Delighted to be here.
All right. And so as you suggested, as we were getting started here, Jack is the name friends use, so we'll be among our history friends here. So
it's a long story, but it's also a really boring one. So I won't go into it for you.
We'll stick with Jack. Let's go to the War of 1812. So I don't think we've had anyone talk in any of these talks cover the War of 1812. And I think probably everybody listening knows something about it. But can you help kind of set the stage for everyone? When did it take place and why?
Well, it's our least known conflict, certainly. And the name kind of gives it away. It did start in 1812, and it essentially ends early in 1815. It grew out of the growing mercantile trade, the carrying trade of the young America, which was promising more and more to give competition to Britain's dominance of the world carrying trade. So there was that problem. American merchants were cutting into British business. And at the same time, with the Royal Navy stopping American ships unlawfully on the high seas, and in many instances simply taking crewmen off of them, claiming that they were deserters from the British Navy and forcing them to go on British ships. Some of them were deserters from the British Navy. Many of them were not. And that is a real affront to any nation's sense of sovereignty and its own rights. But even more so when you're a new nation still kind of trying to establish yourself on the world scene. And finally, and this is a very brief overview, of course, Britain still holds Canada, and they have not forgotten that during the American Revolution, we made more than one effort to try to move into Canada to add it to the 13 colonies. And there's still a considerable fear in Whitehall, in London, that these Americans have their eyes on Canada. And so the War of 1812 kind of grows out of, or Britain's willingness to go to war, kind of grows out of fears over the security of Canada. Whereas the Americans are willing to go to war because they're sick and tired of their ships being boarded and tired of this, what they think is unfair competition for the mercantile trade, especially in the Atlantic.
So what was the spark that set it off? And at what point in the war is the Battle of New Orleans? Again, I think some of us know that, but let's, again, set the stage.
Yeah, it's, excuse me, there's a series, and it takes too long to go into it, of affronts and indignities and incitements that finally persuades the American Congress to go ahead and declare war on Great Britain. We declared war on them. It was not the other way around. And of course, it ends in early 1815. And the several battles for New Orleans are essentially the close of all of the military operations. The one thing that virtually every American schoolboy knows is that the battles of New Orleans were fought after the war supposedly was over, which is true up to a point. A treaty of peace had been agreed upon and signed by the Prince Regent, but it had not been ratified. It had not been signed by James Madison, our president. It hadn't been ratified by the Senate here. So officially, the war was still going on, though there were not going to be any more military operations. So one of the lasting cliches of American history is that the battles for New Orleans were battles that didn't need to be fought because they didn't matter anyhow.
And you said that's a cliche.
I'm sorry, you just cut out there.
Sorry, you're saying that's a cliche because people incorrectly believe that treaties and so forth had actually been signed at that point.
Yeah. It's one of those fun facts that everybody's armed with that have a little bit of truth and a lot of misconception about them. The fact is, the battles did have some importance, and it doesn't mean that if the British had won the Battle of New Orleans and had taken the city of New Orleans, that doesn't mean they were going to continue the war. They wanted the war to be over just as much as we did. They did not really want to take the United States back and make it colonies again. That was never a British aim. They primarily wanted to protect their interests on the high seas and to protect Canada, and to keep the United States small enough that it wasn't going to present a serious challenge to British hegemony elsewhere in the world, especially in the Gulf area and the Western North American continent. But England wanted this war to end because they were fighting a continental war against Napoleon at the same time that was bankrupting the treasury, and it cost them untold amounts of blood and personal and government wealth. The British people and the British government were just tired and worn out, and they would be delighted to have this sideshow in the United States over with.
It's dramatic timing there. We might also just touch on very quickly. So it was also during the War of 1812 that the White House was famously set afire.
Yes,
and it was during the attack on Baltimore, witnessed by Francis Scott Key, that the StarSpangled Banner was written. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. As a matter of fact, the man who put the torch to the White House later took part in the Battle of New Orleans.
Fascinating. Well, so let's go to New Orleans. Tell us a little bit about the city at that point.
New Orleans then, as it is today, was unlike any other American city. You could travel all around the world then, or you could go to New Orleans and see the whole world there. It's one of the two largest cities in America at the time. It's a major economic powerhouse, thanks to its having command of the Mississippi River. And it's worth keeping in mind what made New Orleans so important is the extent to which the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the Ohio and others, penetrated so deeply, all the way to the Rockies in the west, all the way to Pittsburgh in the east, and all the way to the Canadian border. And all of the trade of that whole central region of the North American continent found its way to market by going down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where traders from around the world would come to buy tobacco, barley, hemp, cotton, and more, though cotton wasn't that big yet at that time. So New Orleans is an immensely cosmopolitan and international city. It has a large Jewish population. People don't think about a lot of Jews settling in the South, but they did in New Orleans. It has the largest free Black population of any American city. It has a huge slave population as well. There's the French who were there first. There are tens of thousands of Spaniards who were there before the French. So it's a polyglot. And its streets were just redolent, I think, of all of these various cultures that had settled there and continued to live there, each in their own enclaves, which was one of the problems New Orleans had. It was difficult to get agreement on much of anything in New Orleans because you had half a dozen different ethnic or national interest groups, each arguing their own case. But it was a vibrant place and an exciting place to be, and a somewhat dangerous place because it's right on the frontier. Just to the west of it is largely unsettled territory. And New Orleans is, as much as anything, I think, kind of symbolic of the new American nation, or at least of how Americans saw themselves at that time as this melting pot and this land of entrepreneurs and daring people willing to take chances and take a lenient attitude toward the law, even sometimes leaning this way and sometimes leaning that way. And I think the thought of losing New Orleans itself to many in the East was tantamount to perhaps losing the independence of America.
You mentioned that that New Orleans was the second largest city.
Sorry, your broadcast has gone out again.
That's fine. Am I back? I think we're having maybe a little bit of an internet hiccup. Jack, can you? Am I back with you again?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. You said that New Orleans was the second largest city in the nation at that point. What was the largest?
New York or Philadelphia. Off the top of my head right now, I've forgotten which.
It's fascinating. I don't think anybody would have guessed that the second largest city was New Orleans. It's probably helpful to remember too that this is before the days of railroads, right? So transporting large quantities of things would be done by barge, right, or steam
barges. Flatboat and keel boats, so they could float downriver. They couldn't go upriver. And the steamboat was just being introduced as the War of 1812 began. Okay. So, in fact, limited use of the steamboat will be used in the New Orleans campaign. It's the first time in history that a motor-powered vessel will actually in some way be a participant in military operations.
Interesting. So take us up to the point of the battle. What was going on, and you also referred to, sounds like multiple battles. Is that right?
Everyone, when they speak of the Battle of New Orleans, think of the climactic battle on January 8th, 1815. But in fact, that's one of only 7 engagements that took place. The British lost 5 of those. So it's a much more complex campaign than is generally appreciated, and on a host of levels as well, because really by the time that January 8th battle comes, the British don't have a chance whatever of winning, but they go ahead and attack anyhow. Essentially all the cards are stacked against them. This fleet from England, 2 fleets actually, will meet in the Caribbean to then sail toward Lake Bourne, which opens onto the Gulf off of Lake Pontchartrain, just north of New Orleans. And the idea is that they will approach New Orleans from inland. They'll land in Lake Bourne and then march on New Orleans from the north so they can cut off the city and trap it. The first battle is December 14th, when this little fleet of 5 American gunboats, which is all the naval forces they have just about on the American side, go out into Lake Bourne to try to stop, or at least delay, the thousands of soldiers on barges coming at them from this British fleet. It's a bitter, terribly fought battle. It's extremely bloody and costly, and the Americans lose. All of their ships are captured. They have a considerable number who are killed and wounded, but they do at least delay the British advance for a little bit. And that is a point at which New Orleans needs time. Every hour is very important to it. because there's almost no troops in New Orleans. Washington has kind of neglected New Orleans, paid very little attention to it, which is not untypical of nations' capitals at war, because Washington's eyes were fixed on its own immediate environs. Washington itself had been taken. They're watching out for Baltimore. They're watching out for Philadelphia. And New Orleans is over 1,000 miles away. So what happens is that Andrew Jackson, who's put in command of that general region, has to try to assemble, to bring together from a host of different places, a scratch force to defend New Orleans. And it'll be mostly Tennessean militia, Kentucky militia, some Mississippi militia, one or two regular United States Army units, a company of Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians, some free black soldiers from New Orleans, a few slaves from New Orleans. What's fascinating about this is the first truly American army, because everybody's represented in it. Volunteers, professionals, every ethnicity, Spaniards, French, even the few of the Englishmen who actually live in New Orleans. So any time that Jackson can buy is time for him to put together a larger and larger force. And that little battle on Lake Borgne was very important. What it also did for the British, however, was it gave them command of the shores of Lake Borgne, and they were able to find a way to land their troops and to take them through bayous that were not being guarded, to reach a point where they were only a few miles south of New Orleans on dry land with a road in front of them to take them straight up to the city. It was one of the most miraculous surprise amphibious landings, certainly in our history, though it isn't us who did it, it was the British. But unfortunately, the British, when they got onto dry land on the morning of December 23rd, they were so tired and so worn out and so hungry for fighting their ways through the bayous that their commander decided to stop, feed the men, let them rest. And he wasn't sure how many Americans might be ahead of him, so he wanted to give time for more reinforcements to come up. And that was a fatal delay. He almost certainly could have marched right into New Orleans had he just kept going, but he didn't. Jackson learns that they've landed and immediately sets out and makes an ill-advised night attack. You can't control anything at night, especially in those days of virtually no communications. And it's a battle that seesaws back and forth. It's immensely confused, and Jackson doesn't win it, but he doesn't lose it either. And it stops the British there, who decide to wait for more troops to come up. So more time has been bought again. And then the new commander, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, who is the nephew of Wellington, a man of tremendous prestige in his background, of immense popularity, very popular with the troops, young, dynamic. He comes to take over command. It's a command he did not want, and has almost no choice but to keep pressing toward New Orleans because he knows what's expected of him back in England. And after that, there are a couple of engagements, one on December 28th, where he just sort of does a reconnaissance to see what kind of force Jackson may have. Then on January 1st, he brings forward heavy artillery and tries to bombard into pieces the American line, which won't work because the American fortifications are made of mud. Jackson's men have built in some places, a 15-foot tall wall of mud and earth behind which they place their cannon, and British artillery just buries itself in the mud, doing no harm. And then another week passes, and finally the major battle everyone knows about on January 8th takes place. Lost you again, Lee.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I got you, Carrie.
I think all three of us are having some internet trouble tonight, so we apologize for that. So we got to that January 8th battle. Can you tell us a little bit about that battle and why that is the one that stands out in everyone's mind?
The fight on January 8th, 1815 is the one everybody remembers. General Pakenham his army is on a narrow spit of land between the Mississippi River and impassable swamps. He can only have a battlefront a little over 1,000 yards wide. So the fact that he has 10,000 men doesn't do him any good. He can only get so many men in that front line. And he has no choice but to make a frontal assault on this incredibly strong wall of mud that Jackson's men have built, and behind which Jackson has a lot of artillery. The one great thing New Orleans had in its favor was that before the war, the U.S. Navy had placed a lot of cannon in New Orleans, expecting to use them on ships they never got around to building. But Jackson has all these cannon there waiting for him when he takes over, and many of them are very heavy duty, large caliber, big guns. And as a result, when Pakenham sends his forces forward, they're marching right into the face of a wall of artillery firing at them virtually point blank. American riflemen hardly, this is one of the many myths about the battle, American riflemen almost don't participate because the battle is all fought by American artillery, and virtually all of the casualties that the British will suffer, and they're terrible casualties, will be from artillery. And as a result, after a couple of hours of fighting, Pakenham's army is just completely disrupted, and it has no choice but to try to make its way back in retreat and to its camps, where they'll sit for several days thereafter before they finally withdraw. But on the other side of the Mississippi, this all took place on the eastern side of the Mississippi. On the other side of the Mississippi, the British win the day. On that same day, they land a small force over there that moves forward, manages through a combination of luck, very bad American leadership, and hard fighting. They manage to push forward and push the Americans out of their way until they've actually reached a point where they're just on the bank opposite the city of New Orleans. If they had been able to cross the river, the city might have been theirs. But at that point, they found out that Pakenham has been beaten to pieces on the other side of the river, and they are recalled as the British tried to reform their army for protection. It came that close. Had Pakenham been successful, there's almost no question, I think, that New Orleans would have fallen.
Give us a sense of the number of troops on each side. You described the way in which Jackson had to gather up everyone he could find. How many troops was he able to ultimately assemble?
Jackson, it's hard to tell because numbers are very, let's say the reporting of numbers is very idiosyncratic in the American Army at that time, especially when so many of them are volunteers, some of whom kind of come and go as they choose. On paper, Jackson had somewhere over 10,000 men available to him in or immediately around New Orleans. But in fact, in the actual battle line, he didn't have more than about 2,500, if that. Because again, the field wasn't wide enough to have more. And virtually most of the fighting was in fact done by the gun crews and his artillery.
How interesting. I imagine that communication, organization, and so forth probably challenging amongst those 10,000 men when you've got people drawn from such a wide collection and really coming together for this particular event. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, there are translation problems.
Yeah.
Because Jackson doesn't read French or Spanish, and I'm sure he doesn't know Creek or Chickasaw. Yeah. Some of the French don't speak Spanish. Some of the Spanish don't speak English. Some of the English don't speak French. And then some of the New Orleanians speak a kind of a patois that nobody understands. So it is somewhat chaotic. It's not there are a couple of instances in which it's not unlike the old parlor game that used to be called something whispers, where I whisper something in your ear and you put it in the next person's ear. And after it goes through 20 people, if I've said, the sun's shining today, it may come out at the other end, my sweater's too tight.
Yeah.
It was a problem for them.
Interesting. And what was it like for the residents of New Orleans enduring the battle?
Well, the city, commercially, the city's pretty much shut down. It's something that we're all pretty familiar with these days, thanks to COVID. A great many of the shop owners are, in fact, members of local militia groups So they close their shop doors and pick up their muskets and they go to the front line. There are no commodities coming in because the British have got the Mississippi closed off. Nothing's being shipped out. So the ordinary day-to-day life of the city has been considerably disrupted. But the Orleanians seem to cope with it rather well. There's a considerable sense of anxiety, and there are 2 or 3 occasions on which there's something not quite approaching a panic, but anxiety to the degree that some people are actually leaving. They'll load a few goods on a wagon, get their money out of the bank if they can, if the bank will open, and go up into the upcountry in Louisiana for fear that the city is going to be taken. But most of them stay put. A lot of them become involved in relief work, providing food, making uniforms, or just making clothing for the volunteers. Especially a lot of the Tennessee volunteers arrived with virtually the shirt on their back and nothing else. So you'll find the women of New Orleans, both white and black, free and slave, making a lot of clothing for these volunteers who've worn through their clothing, worn through their shoes as they've marched from Tennessee or Kentucky to get down to Louisiana. And rather like in World War II, with all of the various paper drives and other relief operations, that sense of being involved certainly helped materially, but it probably helped even more in keeping morale. So New Orleans spirits seemed very good. And New Orleanians knew that they were being watched. One of the fascinating things about this battle is that it's the first major event, not just in our history, but in world history, that was intensely covered in the press. The way newspapers worked in those days, if you published a newspaper in New Orleans, and there were 5 to 6 being published in 2 languages, sometimes 3, you would send copies of your newspaper to the editors of 10 or 20 newspapers in the North and elsewhere in the South on an editorial exchange, and they would send you copies of their newspapers. And then you'd lift things out of each other's newspapers to fill your own columns. Well, everybody in the East, everybody outside New Orleans, wants to know what's happening in New Orleans. And so you have this steady stream of letters going out every week. A mail writer leaves once a week, and his bags were full every week of letters being written by people in New Orleans to friends or family everywhere from Charleston, South Carolina to Boston, Massachusetts. And the first thing the recipients do is, after they've read the letters, they take it downtown to their local newspaper editor and give it to him, and he publishes the letter so his readers can see what they know about what's happening in New Orleans. It's really a landmark exchange of information and human experience, the like of which we had not seen before. And part of the purpose of all this correspondence, I think, is for these people in New Orleans to be able to show everyone else in the United States that their courage is screwed to the sticking point. They're staying with it. Their morale is high.
At this point, was there any other conflicts in the United States at that point, or was everything centered on New Orleans?
Pretty much the war has wound down elsewhere in the United States. The British campaigns had mostly been concentrated on defending Canada and turning back American raids into Canada. Other, of course, than the landing that took Baltimore and Washington. And they attempt to make some landings in the South Carolina coast, but very little is going on elsewhere. Keep in mind, this is January, so it's winter everywhere from Washington north. And one of the reasons, in fact, that the British launched the invasion of Louisiana in the first place was to try to distract American attention from the East, because a lot of these battles being fought in anywhere from Maryland up to New York and all are being fought by American armies that have a lot of volunteer militia from Kentucky and Tennessee. Well, the invasion of Louisiana, it was hoped, would draw these Kentucky and Tennessee volunteers that kept coming forward away from the Northeast and down to the Southwest to take the pressure off the British in the Northeast. But essentially by late December 1814, the war is confined to Louisiana and Florida to a lesser extent.
Very interesting. Take us through then to the conclusion of that and what was going on in parallel in terms of negotiating a peace treaty of sorts.
Well, both sides wanted out of this war. Neither side gained anything from it. It cost them a great deal of money. It cost them a lot of blood. And they were both sick and tired of it after 2 years. I think both kind of regretted they'd gotten into it in the first place. I've forgotten the exact date, but it was agreed, I think, as early as October, perhaps even September 1814, that peace negotiations would be held in Europe between representatives of both sides trying to find an accommodation. And no one's looking for a surrender. They're just trying to find terms on which they can agree to end the war. Those negotiations actually conclude in December, and the copies of the treaty created by the diplomats involved will be sent to London to be viewed by Parliament and by the Foreign Secretary, and of course finally signed by the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent George IV. While other copies will go to America. They go in 2 vessels to make sure that at least one of them gets through. But it takes more than a month to get a letter from London to Washington. It's always important to remember in that era that time is never on anybody's side unless you want delay, because it just takes forever for information to get anywhere. And of course, Congress or the Senate will approve the treaty, and James Madison will sign it. Again, I apologize, I've forgotten the date on which he signed it. But then the ratified treaty has to get back to London to be exchanged with a copy of the ratified treaty from London. So there's more time gone back and forth. The people involved in the battle in the New Orleans campaign don't find out the war is over until sometime in February 1815, when officially, according to the treaties, it's been over for a couple of months.
Fascinating. What are maybe 2 or 3 of the things that you think folks should take away from this? Historical insight about our country at this time.
I think, well, for a start, viewed from the vantage point of hindsight, when you see what the odds were, at least on paper, against the United States, I think you have to be impressed with the enormous optimism. We were young. As a nation, we were 23, 24, 25 years old. We were cocky and full of ourselves, and had to be, I think, to figure that we could take on the greatest empire on the planet and have any hope of coming out of it, let alone being a winner, just coming out of it, period, intact. The sense of American hubris almost and self-confidence is still, to me, somewhat surprising, given the fact that I know what they didn't know, which is how great the odds were that were arrayed against them. About the battles itself, well, of course, I think one thing certainly we've already discussed, and that's the business of it really wasn't the kind of battle you see in the movie The Buccaneer with Yul Brynner. It was a battle of artillery against infantry standing out in the open, just getting the crap kicked out of it. The rifleman, the volunteer, who will become an American icon as a result of this battle, had very little to do actually in the January 8th, 1815 battle itself. So it's a study in contradictions between what actually happened and how we choose to perceive it. But that is the case with a great deal of our history, which tends to get massaged and mythologized into a form in which it fits the kind of narrative we like to see or think of as related to our country and our history and ourselves. And that's not just the War of 1812. That applies pretty much throughout our past. And it's not a distinctly American trait. It's a human trait.
Indeed, indeed. Well, this has been very interesting. I'm going to add one note, and I think Carrie's going to join us in just a second with some questions that we've gotten with respect to the battle for the siege of Baltimore and the StarSpangled Banner and so forth. There is a very interesting display. At least there was a couple of years ago when I was at the Maryland Historical Society. You can see the original writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, and they had a very interesting display of what Dolly Madison addressed that she would have worn at the time, and some furniture that was recreated from plans that had been saved. And I was just so interested in this furniture, which is from that period when things were inspired by Egypt. And so you have this very distinctive furniture, and it's just impossible to imagine that style in the White House, but apparently that was the style of the day. So it's worth the trip if folks get to go to the Maryland Historical Society. So Carrie, thanks for joining us. What questions have we gotten?
All right, our first question is about your interest in this subject. So you're a very well-known Civil War historian. What made you shift 50 years earlier to this period?
Man does not live by the Civil War alone. Having done so much in that field, I kind of ran out of topics that were interesting to me that I wanted to work on. Plus, there are so many first-class historians working in the field of Civil War studies in general that what remains to be done that needs doing, it just isn't something that fits into what I like to do. My interest is in really digging in deep detail into the original records and often finding original documents in private hands to be able to tell a story from the time it took place rather than relying on what people have written about it afterward. So I've done several books that weren't on the Civil War. One on called Three Roads to the Alamo. That's, it's a book about the Alamo. It's hard to maintain suspense as to how it's going to end. But it's really a triple biography of David Crockett, James Bowie, and William Barrett Travis, who were the three icons who come out of the Alamo experience and how they represent the three different kinds of Americans who are pushing white settlement west across the old Southwest. And the book on the Lafitte's, and it just seemed time to do something else. And looking around, there have been several books about the battle in New Orleans, and a couple of good ones, but it had been a long time, and none of them had ever gone into the depth of research that I like to do in the Foreign Record Office in London and other places here and abroad to winkle out aspects of the story that we would never know about otherwise. And just for the benefit of your viewers, in case they're not aware of it, something that today makes this much easier than it has ever been for historians before is this now maybe 20-year-old business of being able to create digital images of newspapers and to create word search programs that allow you to actually look specifically for things in newspapers. The first books I did were done searching newspapers page by page by page at a time in a dark archive, blowing out my eyesight, hoping I would find something. And now with these searches, like one of genealogybank.com is one of them, but there are many. In an afternoon, I could do more productive research than I could do in a year, 50 years ago. And what it has done is opened up so many things, like, as we were discussing earlier, all these letters that come out of New Orleans, half of which that I found have never been seen before because nobody happened to be looking for them when it was possible to find them. I think I count somewhere close to about 300 letters coming out of New Orleans in that December-January period. And that's an enormous archive of material of human interest, social history, military history, etc. And so the Battle of the New Orleans campaign, and it really hadn't been told very well from the British side, to try to present a balanced account from both sides, presented the kind of challenge that I like to take on. It, for me, the research is the fun. Writing the book is what you have to do after you've had the party. Sooner or later, you have to wash the dishes.
That sounds good. All right, we have a viewer who was very intrigued about the naval artillery pieces and would like to know who manned them. Were they trained or did they just kind of get lucky?
The naval artillery pieces are manned by a variety of people. Some of them were saved from a United States vessel that was in the Mississippi supporting Jackson's line earlier on, before the January 8th battle, the Carolina, and they got a couple of guns off of it. But better yet, they got the gun crew from the Carolina. So they had naval men who were experienced at handling this artillery actually in one or more of their batteries. In another battery, they had some of the men who had been privateers and smugglers, more or less under the command of Pierre Lafitte. One of many myths about the battle is that Jean Lafitte helped to win it. He was not there. We don't know for sure where he was, but we're pretty sure that he was in fact down in the Bayou country south, headed toward the coast, guarding a possible avenue or back door to New Orleans. So he's definitely involved, but he's not in the battle. But his brother Pierre is right in the fight pretty much from the first. And Captain Dominique, who was played by Charles Boyer in the movie, commands a battery of artillery manned entirely by the Barratarian privateers and smugglers. So it's different crews for different ones, but happily all of them have some experience with artillery.
Okay. Another question, let's see, were the prisoner exchanges similar to what we experienced during the Civil War?
Well, that's a good question. Kind of yes and no. There are almost no American prisoners taken because the British are driven from the battlefield. Some American prisoners were taken in that December 23rd fight. Also, of course, there are the prisoners who were taken off the 5 gunboats that were captured on Lake Bourne. And they will be held aboard a British vessel, I forget the name, Hyperion, I think, which essentially is turned into a hospital and prison ship. They're well treated. And eventually they will be traded, back in February 1815, long after the battle, they will be traded in exchange for quite a number of British prisoners, most of whom had been wounded, who are collected from the battlefield on January 8th after the fight is over. So they don't get sent off to prison camps. There isn't enough time. They're simply exchanged before the British fleet leaves to return home.
Okay. All right. After Mr. Madison's war, I believe that all aggressions against American shipping collapsed. Neither Britain, France, nor Spain would stop American ships, I believe. I think of that as a massive political victory. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it certainly is. There are some scattered instances of the British continuing to stop a vessel, but they go about it in a different way that is not as confrontational. Generally, what will happen is if they happen to be in port with American vessels, and if they can demonstrate that someone in the crew of the American vessel was a deserter from a British vessel, then there may be some negotiation as to whether or not that person will be returned. But in most cases, they won't be given up, because the American point of view is that these men are now in our Navy, or they're in our merchant Navy. They're now Americans. And England has kind of learned its lesson, in that it's learned that these Yankees are willing to fight over an issue like this, and nobody, British or American, wants to fight again for a while after 1815.
Okay. We have a viewer who would like to know if you can share some of your online research sources. And if you would like, you can send those to me and I will post them for people.
Oh, sure, I'll be happy to. One of them, of course, I just mentioned is the genealogybank.com. Can I make a further comment in that general line?
Mhm.
Don't discount genealogical work. Professional historians for generations were very condescending toward genealogists. They're called genies at the National Archives, or used to be. But my experience over the years has been that many genealogists actually have shown a little more imagination than trained professional historians in where they look for sources and in what they can sometimes derive from those sources. So the historians have something to learn from them. And I think it's only a matter of time before Ancestry.com has its own network. This started very small 20 some years ago, and now it's an immense organization that is just digitizing all of this stuff like crazy. I'm not a genealogist. I have some interest in family history, but I don't spend much time on it. But what a historian can find there, from the censuses indexed so that you can find things, down to local county records in some cases, is an enormous godsend to the researcher. But I'll be happy to send you a list of other sources that
All
you
right.
put on.
Thank you. All right. Well, this has been great. We had great questions from viewers tonight, and we learned a lot. Thank you so much. We do have a link for Jack's book in the chat. We have a working link now. So check that out. There's, of course, lots more in there to learn. Next week, March 11th, we will be speaking with historian Emerson Baker about the Salem witch trials. So we hope to see you then. Have a good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Carrie.